The following panel is part of the Comics Arts Conference. The CAC is an academic conference that takes place every year at WonderCon and the San Diego Comic-Con. Our mission is to bring academics and professionals together with the public to discuss the medium that we all love. Because of its academic focus, CIC programming is a little different from other con programming. We hope you enjoy it. You can find more information about the CAC, including how to apply to present at future meetings, at our website at comicsartsconference.wp.txstate.edu.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Comics Arts Conference of the Comic-Con International, which you may know as the San Diego Comic-Con. And this is the Contract with God in Depth panel. I'm Danny Fingeroth. I'm a writer and editor of comics, books about comics. I wrote a book about Stan Lee. I'm also the chair of Will Eisner Week, an annual celebration of, oddly enough, Will Eisner every March. If you want to know more about it or if you'd like to do an event, please go to willeisner.com, and we hope you will be able to participate in or join an event not unlike this. Before I have everybody else introduce themselves so that they can tell you more accurately than I could, I did just want to kind of dedicate this panel to M. Thomas Inge, who died a few weeks ago. I guess when you see this in July, it'll be a couple of months ago. Tom, I didn't know very well, but all my interactions with him were just wonderful. He was generous with his time, with his research, with his intellect, and he was a big fan and historian of all things Will Eisner, and edited a book called Will Eisner Conversations, and I'm sure many other things that I don't even know about, but we miss him, and just thought it'd be a nice gesture to dedicate this to him. And now I will go by the pictures, little pictures on my screen, and start with Andrew Kunka. Andrew, tell us about yourself and your connection to Will Eisner and his work.
Okay, thanks, Danny. I'm Andrew Kunka. I'm English professor and chair of the department at University of South Carolina Sumter. I've written a couple books, one on autobiographical comics and one forthcoming in December, The Life and Comics of Howard Cruse, Taking Risks in the Spirit of Truth. And my connection to Will Eisner is that I've done a lot of research in the Will Eisner papers at Ohio State University's Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum. And from that research, I've written a couple essays, one on that's forthcoming, on kind of fan letters and responses to reprints of The Spirit, and the other one on letters that Will Eisner exchanged with Jack Katz, the creator of The First Kingdom.
Denis Kitchen.
Well, I was lucky enough to meet Will at my very first comic convention in 1971, and that led to my soon becoming his publisher via Kitchen Sink Press. That continued until 1999, and then I became his art agent and his literary agent.
NC Christopher Couch, but you can call him Chris.
So I was an editor at Kitchen Sink Press for 5 years. Thank you, Dennis. And I was Will Eisner's in-house editor there. I teach history of comics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and at the School of Visual Arts. And I was really honored to bring Will Eisner to the University of Massachusetts Amherst twice. Once for a 20th anniversary conference for Contract with God. That was supported by a lot of wonderful institutions, including MTV. And it's the basis for Will Eisner Profession Cartoonist, the video series. Both times when I brought him to UMass Amherst, it was recognized with front page feature articles in the arts sections of the New York Times, written by cultural critics. The second time he came, he announced the plot, and I was honored to work with him as a research assistant on that. And I've co-authored 2 books about Will, the Will Eisner Companion with Steve Weiner, and Will Eisner, an exhibition catalog for a show at the MoCA Museum in New York.
So Travis, tell us about yourself and your relation to Will and or his work.
I am a distinguished professor of psychology at Henderson State University, a place where Will Eisner visited once upon a time. And while I'm best known for writing something about Batman, I have also lately been the producer and tech guy on these videos that we've been doing at conventions and for people to use with their programs for Will Eisner Week.
Indeed, yes, and you should check out those programs at the Will Eisner Week site on YouTube. There's a lot of very cool stuff that we did this past March, and again, if you haven't seen it, some really wonderful, wonderful stuff. Thank you. The origin of this is Dennis and John Lind put together a few years ago what's called the Contract with God Curators Collection, which we'll talk about in a minute. That was a monumental feat of scholarship and editing and production, and so that sort of was the kernel of this, and so that'll be a lot of the images you'll see, and it's sort of interesting because, of course, it's Contract with God, the book that came out over 40 years ago that so many people have read and is in so many syllabi, if that's the plural of syllabus. Probably better than syllabuses, but whatever it is, a lot of people teach it and have read it, and but this book was really a landmark, and again you'll see why. And so that's the core of this. But everybody here has something smart and insightful that they've said in the past about Will, and will say again, and maybe discover new stuff. This is the 2-volume and the lovely slipcase. How did this come to be, this Curator's collection?
It's something that John and I had talked about for some years. He happened to see them. The Eisner art is housed in my home, and so John sometimes gets a sneak peek at it. And so we long talked about the idea of 2 volumes that would show the pencils and the inks in side-by-side companion volumes. It's rare, if not unprecedented, that a book of this stature survived in both its preliminary form and its final form. And so all of the material here was shot from the original art at exceptionally high resolution. So it's as good as looking at the originals themselves.
That's young Will Eisner with hair, not a toupee, not implants. Actual Will Eisner hair. Will must be, what, 23 here, I think? Something like
it's 1940.
Will was a artist and writer and packager in the golden age of comics, when Superman and Batman and Captain America first appeared. And he was hired by a newspaper syndicate to do a comic book insert, because all the kids were crazy about those new comics. So this came to be called the Spirit section, and it was 16 pages with a self cover. And so Will, I guess, was probably one of the things he's best known for is the wide variety of in effect covers, but really the first page of Spirit stories with a different innovative design every time. And then of course he came through with the goods. He did stories that set the mark for every other artist who followed him in comics, much of it echoing the New York tenements that he grew up in. It was called Central City. In some stories, Will would slip in a Yiddish pun. He was from those Jewish tenements of Brooklyn and the Bronx. So my name is Mazel, Slim Mazel. That's and you might say that my chief claim to fame is hard luck. Well, Shlemazel is an unlucky person. It's the Yiddish expression for it. Again, New York, the Bronx, whatever you want to call it, though he called it Central City, this is just Will's vision of a Bronx candy store in the Jewish neighborhoods of his childhood. And it kind of reeks with atmosphere, and I use the word reek in a good way, but these are just the people Will would have known and grown up with. Will became aware of the underground comics movement of the late 60s, early 70s. He met this guy, and this is Denis Kitchen, looking exactly the same as he does today, except different facial hair. And this was the era, of course, of Zap Comics, and the whole movement, including Denis's Kitchen Sink, which at a certain point started putting out reprints of Will's classic spirits, and then new material by Will. Will kind of got involved in another kitchen sink magazine called Snarf, where I don't remember the exact story, but Denis can tell us. So from this, Will realized there was an older audience that was not just kids and wanted more than superheroes. Factor in this elements like this guy named Jan Pierce, who was a Metropolitan Opera star, who was also a cantor and sang a lot of Yiddish folk songs, including, with my research, I think I was one of the first people to find this, but a popular song of its day called A Plea to God, sung by Jan Pierce. Other people sang it. This is called Din Torah mit Gott, which is basically means a contract with God. There's a poem, I'm not quite sure of the origin of it, by the Kaddish of Rev Levi Yitzchak Bardashever, and I don't know anything more about him than what it says here on this page. But if you look in the translation, the Yiddish is on the left, transliterated, and on the right, I, Levi Yitzchak, son of Sarah from Berdyshev, have come to you in a lawsuit on behalf of your people, Israel. This is, I don't know for a fact, I never had a chance to ask Will, but I have to think that this was in the back of his mind or his subconscious, creating contract with God. This is a movie called The Angel Levine, based on a Bernard Malamud story in which Harry Belafonte and Zero Mostel star, and the Mostel character, you can get a look at him there, I think is very much, at least, it seems to me Will used it as something of a model for the main character in the lead story in Contract with God, which is that was the original, I believe it's the original edition of Contract with God. And that brings us to these two guys. So Denis, finally, pick up the story.
John designed this book himself, and he was the editor, so he's more responsible than I was, though I contributed an essay and certainly was part of it. One of the wonderful discoveries, I would say, in doing this was the changes that Will made. Some things he penciled and chose not to ink, for example. My very favorite, if you happen to have it, there's the page where the young Frimi Hirsch is in Siberia and he's first writing his contract with God on a slate. So in the pencil version, Will had what you saw in the final inked version, but there was a paste up. And Will tended to put his paste ups in those days on top of the first original using rubber cement. And any of you have any experience with rubber cement, you know that after some years, it dries up and it no longer has any adherence. So the top panel fell off, and underneath, I couldn't believe what I saw. It was the actual legal language that was Will's first thought that this young Frimi Hirsch put on the slate. He obviously thought better of it for reasons I think were smart, but none of us had any idea that there actually was a contract. I think he decided not to include it in the final version because it probably would have been a distraction and people would have argued over the language and how could a young boy have even written in any kind of legalese and so forth. But that was a rather stunning revelation and my favorite. But there are other examples in the book where he also created pencils and he failed to ink them. One was in the super chapter, where the German-born super of the Dropsy Avenue tenement is shown in a flashback in Germany, first having issues with his mother, and then being a brown shirt. So again, I think Will thought, this guy's already a heavy. I don't need to show him with mother issues and as a Nazi, so he chose not to include it. In another segment where the family is going on their summer vacation, there are a half a dozen or 8 pages, as I recall, that he penciled and chose not to include. They involve the family's ride on a train, where really nothing much happens, and I think for length he edited them out. So when you actually compare page by page, there will be a number of surprises, pages you didn't know existed that he self-edited out, and then others where there are subtle changes in both the layout and the language. So it's a book of revelations in a way.
You know, my experience as an editor with comics artists is that if they have to ink something on vellum, they hate it. It just is an incredible extra work. And yet Will did this book more or less print size, which was printed as, I guess, as a trade paperback of its day. But he inked it. That's why we have this book, is because he did the inking on vellum, which is kind of a translucent paper.
His pencils were so tight that if you compare some of them, I mean, they're virtually the same. So he inked them very, very much as they existed. So only in instances where he changed his mind do you see significant changes. I'm grateful, of course, because the pencils are preserved. There's no other instance where Will's pencils are preserved. You see his very rough thumbnails on other graphic novels, but they're much, much rougher than these tight pencils. So this was a unique opportunity, and there will never be another book like this about Will's work unless you use the much rougher thumbnails in comparison.
Oh, Dennis, I think I found it. This is the contract.
There it is. There you have the bottom half of the young Frimmy Hirsch falling away, revealing the whereas and therefore language, which, you know, if you know anything at all about Will, you knew he was a very astute businessman, and he was not a lawyer, but he thought like a lawyer. And he wrote his own contracts, and it just was his instinct. If he's doing a book called A Contract with God, of course, there must be a contract, and he will write it. So I laughed. I truly laughed when I saw that this was his first instinct. But the editor in him thought better of it and covered it up and left it to the reader's imagination.
Now in the story, he does tell God what he expects of him, right? I mean, I'll be a pious Jew and you will. In
general terms, but not specific. Yeah.
So, you know, I think the editor and maybe the writer in him too realize that whatever you think you believe, everybody has their own contract with God. So maybe it's better left to the imagination. That's my profound observation. Did you learn, I guess, I know what it was. Did Will generally work did he write a script or did he kind of, how did he, and this is open to everybody else who studies his work process too. Were there steps that were usual?
I never saw a script. If he had scripts, they did not survive. He had notes. Mm-hmm. He'd have longhand notes with little tiny sketches, and they evolved. I never saw a full-blown script.
And would he jot down like a very basic outline on like a legal pad or something, or?
Sometimes yes, but I think for the most part it was just in his head. He knew what he wanted to do, and he didn't need a script. I think he scripted it as he penciled it.
Incredible. Do you think and again, this is open to anybody. Do you think after Contract with God, Will essentially did a graphic novel a year pretty much till he died for the next 25 years. Do you think he had any notion he would do that? Or was he doing this as a one-off, or do you think he was doing it as the first in a series?
I will say, I think he didn't know he'd be doing an average of one a year for the next quarter century, because he had no idea what the reaction would be to this one.
Right.
And I think he was pleased enough with what he did and the reaction and how it helped in many ways shape the industry and the views of other creators, that he was then encouraged, and he got great pleasure out of it. And so, as we now know, he did another 20 or so of this nature, but I don't think it was part of a grand plan in 1978.
One that raises a question for me, because I remember looking at when Signal from Space or Life on Another Planet is serialized. There's not a lot of time between the publication of Contract with God and the beginning of that serialization. So did he start that new project pretty quickly after finishing this?
I think so, yes, but that was a different experiment. That was his only real science fiction graphic novel.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very different from everything else he did after that. I think, to me, Life on Another Planet is kind of an extension of the Spirit. If you take that character, Jim Blood, even with the hat, he's kind of a stand-in for the Spirit. So I think it wasn't until he started doing additional autobiographical material based on his own life and his wife Anne's life that I think he saw there were a lot of stories he wanted to tell. And of course, some were purely fictional, and at the very end, the plot was purely didactic. But again, I don't think there was a grand plan other than Will was grateful to jump back into comics after taking too many years off doing commercial work and Army work. This was what really made him feel fulfilled, I think.
I would think before he did A Contract with God, he would have had no idea what personal impact it would have had upon him. It's like, am I going to do this thing or not? And he, for all he knew, he was going to feel worse after saying these things. And so I would imagine that it gave him something cathartic or some kind of release, that he felt good enough to, I want to keep doing this.
So I'll chime in here. So what I tell my students, and this was my experience with Will, is that his idea was to take comics to an adult audience. That's the thing he most wanted to do. And when he did A Contract with God, first of all, he was talking to his students at the School of Visual Arts, who were these, young artists, Curtis Billingsley, especially Batten Lash, who were trying to push the boundaries of comics as art. And they were not underground cartoonists. They were New Yorkers, and they were trying to do new comics as art. And Will was inspired by them. And he brought drafts of the stories into class to show the students what he was doing on Contract with God. And I believe that what Will was doing with Contract with God was to take comics to a new audience, to an adult audience, in a way that moved beyond the undergrounds. And if you look at Contract with God, I used to give a talk called Will Eisner Semiotician in academic contexts. Mm-hmm. And people would say, well, where did he study semiotics? And I felt like telling them, in the streets, in the Talmud. He didn't study semiotics. He was a semiotician. And when he did Contract with God, not only was it a legitimate novel, but it was published by a trade house. It was not published by a comics house, and he had to pay to have that done. He went to Baronet, this little publisher, which was aimed at the bookstore market. And the most brilliant semiotic thing he did was the trim size of the original book. Okay, and the trim size of the book block in A Contract with God is the specific trim size for a literary novel. And I actually looked this up in a textbook of publishing from the time, which explains to students of publishing what the formats mean about books. And the trim size of Contract with God is the trim size of a literary novel. And what he was doing was taking black and white, semi-autobiographical, graphic works, the size, length, and complexity of a novel into bookstores to be read by adults. So, and I believe that when Mouse came out, that is exactly what that was. I believe that was the future. I don't know how he saw that in 1976 when he started doing this. Dennis says jokes sometimes about they smoked pipes with different things in them. So, you know, but that was an incredible visionary move by Will Eisner. And he always, whenever I worked with him, he said, I want to, you know, I want these not to be treated as comics. I remember Last Day in Vietnam, we talked about that. A Family Matter, we talked about that. You know, I'm doing things here to take this away from the comics thing. And that's what he cared about. He wanted adults to go to bookstores and buy comics.
Yeah.
So that's what I think he was up to.
A small sidebar to the fact that Baronet published this in New York. I had assumed when Will had been telling me about this secret project that I would publish it. I was his publisher. And when it was finally done and he showed it to me, I was very excited. And then he said, unfortunately, Dennis, I'm going to take this somewhere else. And I said, why? What did I do wrong? I was at that time living in a little town in central Wisconsin, and my actual address was number 2 Swamp Road. And he said to me, Dennis, for this book, I need a publisher with a Park Avenue address, not Swamp Road.
Andrew, did your research in Will's correspondence and papers turn up anything about his thought process at the time of contract, especially the stuff with Jack Katz?
You know, the stuff with Jack Katz, I mean, Jack's doing the First Kingdom and sending a lot of people copies of the First Kingdom. He sends them to Milton Caniff. He sends them to Will, and you know, and talks about the idea of this larger project as a graphic novel. And this is about 1974, 1976. You know, I think if you were to look, you know, to compare First Kingdom and Contract with God, there's not a lot to say about those two works in comparison. But you know, I think back then beyond that to an interview Will did with John Benson in 1968, where they're talking about specifically about Gil Kane's His Name is Savage, and Will says something about not seeing where the market is for this, like who's going to buy this. I think he mentioned some of George Metzger's work too, like who's going to buy this. And so I didn't know Will at all, and so I don't want to speculate too much about thought process, but it does seem like, and this is probably true for a lot of artists, to be this kind of battle between art and commerce going on, that he had a vision for pushing comics forward in the way that, you know, that Chris described, but at the same time someone had to buy it. And so if he's thinking about that as far back as 1968 and probably even earlier than that, I'm imagining something happens with, you know, meeting Dennis and seeing the underground and so on.
He hadn't been to a comic convention. He didn't see what was developing with fandom. He was, in a sense, in a vacuum, unaware of that when he said there was no market for things like His Name is Savage. Mm-hmm. So I think it was an eye-opener when Phil Suling invited him to see what was happening.
Mm-hmm. I always wonder if there's a connection there, because also Gil Kane does Black Mark for Ballantine, and Oscar, is it Distel? Is that how the name's pronounced? Was the force behind that. So then when Will brought Contract with God to him, and his famous response was, "We don't publish comic books." I always wondered if we don't publish comic books anymore. That is that the failure of Black Mark to be, you know, a big deal was, or to continue as a series, was kind of had an effect on, kind of cooled them to doing something with Will.
So I have another little thought about this, which ties into who's going to buy this. And one of the things I liked a lot about Will was that he was extremely strategic. And in the 1970s, Jewish American literature was having a moment. It was extraordinarily successful. In 1976, Saul Bellow won the Nobel Prize for Literature, specifically mentioning Augie March. Also in 1976, a book was published called World of Our Fathers, the Eastern European Jews, How They Came to America and the World They Created There by Irving Howe. That was a massive bestseller for years and years and years, and really launched a moment of nostalgia and interest in and rediscovery for Jewish life on the Lower East Side. It was a cultural earthquake almost. These two things happened in 1976. In 1978, Will Eisner publishes a graphic novel for adults in bookstores in black and white that appears on the surface, at least for a moment, to be a literary graphic novel about Jewish life in New York. So I think he knew, or he hoped, that there would be an audience for this that would respect it in a literary way, because if Saul Bellow can win a Nobel Prize, well, maybe Will Eisner can publish a graphic novel. And actually, Danny, if you could bring up my first two slides, I'd be really grateful.
Sure.
The first story, In a Contract with God, is really the most Jewish story in it, okay? And it's about a father losing a daughter, and we know heartrendingly that that's Will losing Alice and all of that. But the scene where Fremela Hirsch comes home is taken directly, almost exactly, from the performance of Marie Schwartz in Tevier. And it's the moment, if you're a Jewish person, you're looking at this in a bookstore, you see this, you're going to say, I have no daughter. You're practically going to start crying, right? Because it's Marie Schwartz there on those pages of that book in the most emotional moment of Shalom Aleichen's most famous work that becomes Fiddler on the, and all of that. So can I have the next slide too, then, after that? So this is the model for Fremela Hirsch, is Marie Schwartz. And there is no way that a Jewish reader is going to pick up this book and not say, oh my God, I know exactly what this is. And I think, as I said,
well, I think they would know it by way of Fiddler on the Roof. I don't think there were that many people who saw the 1937 Tevye and his daughters, but
you
Fiddler on the Roof,
would
everybody
be surprised. That was also a moment when Yiddish film was being rediscovered. That's where Will took these images from.
You know, that's a very good point.
And Yiddish theater was having a moment as well. There's a famous PBS thing that I show in my classes on 2nd Avenue with Mandy Patinkin hosting it. And, there's all this interest. It follows World of Our Fathers. It was a moment, believe me, everybody knew who Marie Schwartz was in the New York Jewish community in the 1970s. You just knew. So, in my opinion, I wasn't there, but what can I tell you?
Well, I was, and I was, of course, I was obsessed with this stuff and a film student. So, I was one of the few people who'd, been a Moshe Osher fan at age 6. So I'm really probably not the typical audience,
Well, but there was a massive audience for World of Our Fathers.
Right. That is that. And the Yiddish film revival, you're right about that. That's when Sharon Revo started the Yiddish Film Center at Brandeis. All that stuff was going on. And
But Will was strategic.
One of the things I think about with that strategic nature that you're talking about too is that there's also enough explanation in here for someone who wasn't familiar with some of the cultural touchstones. So we learn what a kukulin is. That probably wasn't necessary for the audience, Chris, that you're describing.
I love hearing you guys pronounce Yiddish words.
Can you do it again?
I must pronounce them, but the effort is really appreciated.
What is it? What is it?
Kukulin.
Oh, kukulin. Sorry.
Kukulin. I'm sure somebody.
I should. Yeah.
Somebody who really knows Yiddish would correct me. Andrew, I'm sorry. Were you in the middle of it?
No. That's it. It's interesting what Chris is saying because like I said, as I was reading it, from obviously the perspective that can't even pronounce some of these words, that there's enough, explanation there of the cultural touchstones that I was able to get it. So he's got that. He seems to have that audience in mind too, as well.
Oh, sure. Jules Feiffer's great comic book heroes informed a whole generation that there was such a person as Will Eisner. I mean, that's mine too.
That is how I discovered Eisner, was through Feiffer's book.
Me too.
Yeah.
So, because everything else, okay, here's an old Superman story, here's an old Batman story, here's an old Hawk. What the hell is the Spirit?
I discovered him through, this is ingrained in my memory, going to a barber shop when I was about 8 years old, and when there was one of the Warren Christmas special spirits with the the blind kid with the black glasses, was like, that was ingrained in my mind. I was a comic reader at the time, but it was mainly like, Richie Rich and stuff like that. And then that image just was like, there was something both kind of unsettling and attractive about it at the same time. So, and I didn't even know what it was. And so then years later, when I'm discovering kind of the Spirit as a whole, realizing, oh, that's that image from that, semi-traumatic barbershop experience.
Well, imagine what the barbershop experience would have been like if the comic had the story of that guy on death row getting the haircut.
Yeah.
You would never got another haircut for the rest of your life.
This is another chapter in Will Eisner as a strategist, which is when it came time to create a graphic novel for adults to go into a bookstore, Will created a new artistic style for his graphic novel. And it was based on Franz Masriel and German Expressionism, and also on the American Ashcan School artists like John Sloan. This is John Sloan's famous cover from The Masses about the Rockefeller Massacre in Colorado. And Will had not worked in black and white before. He had not done this kind of style. He invented a new style which carried certain messages to the readers. Again, it's the 1970s. There's a lot of cultural ferment. People would know who Kit the Kollwitz was and things like that. And also the Ashcan School as a politically aware artistic style was still alive. So by doing a graphic novel in this style, it carried a message of social relevance, political awareness, and cultural authenticity that became characteristic of Will Eisner's graphic novels. Anyway, so there's a lot of strategy in this book, In Contract with God. Will really found a cultural moment and created an explosive that might go off.
Travis, again, for everybody, but especially since Travis is our designated psychology professor, Will Eisner spends his life drawing the Spirit, drawing how to talk to your plants, drawing how to not blow up your gun. Where the hell, whatever he did, as great as it was, he was not revealing a lot about Will Eisner. Where does he suddenly come up with these? Contract, the various stories, the stories of Will disguised in various ways. Cuchulainn is pretty much all autobiographical to the point of calling the character Willie. Where does somebody come up with that after years of doing stuff that's not personal, and suddenly the next 25 years it's all out there?
This is something I think about a lot and wonder about a lot. It's not like he talked very easily about certain aspects of his life. There are a lot of people who said he never did talk about Alice around them. There was a biographer who was spending time with Will, and he'd been told repeatedly, don't ask about his kids, until Will finally got to talking about himself, and will even say, I know you need to know this. But those are the kinds of things that somebody has suppressed, not repressed. He knew it happened, but at least out loud suppressed, holding back. And things people hold on to, they create a weight in us. If I mean, some things get forgotten, some things get left behind, but clearly he had these things weighing on him, especially the death of Alice, and he wasn't expressing these other ways. And probably at a point in his life, on reflecting on where his career was, where it had been, the things he wasn't still doing, and he had this great need. And while we talk repeatedly about the cultural impact of A Contract with God, the impact on the industry and the graphic novel itself, and those are very important things. I was really fascinated with his own need to do this. The things he's going through, this grief, this anguish, and the name itself, The Contract with God, that's reflecting just this basic question of, I know some people say it's this question of why do bad things happen to good people, but he's more like he's getting into why do bad things happen to people, especially those who've been trying to be faithful with God. Because, I mean, you go through, especially the other stories in there, he's not always writing about good people. He's showing that they're not all good, they're not all bad. He's got con artists and others throughout the set of stories that we're calling a graphic novel. But he's asking these questions. There's the underlying theme of social psychology is that the world is a scary, chaotic place, and we do all kinds of stuff to convince ourselves that it makes more sense than it really do. We want it to make sense. We see patterns, we see conspiracy theories, we do all sorts of things. We want the world to make sense to us, and he wanted his pain to make sense. And there's this just world phenomenon. We do all kinds of things to try to see the world as just, and if we can't, it can just weigh on us. And he'd have had these weights that he needed to express somehow. And what I brought up earlier, I'm just wondering, it's like, it may not have completely unburdened him and helped him get over anything, or he wouldn't have kept doing these autobiographical things. But I think clearly he got enough emotionally out of the process that he felt like continuing to do it on the personal side, not just the Will Eisner, the businessman side. And we know he was a businessman when he was a teenager.
That's really interesting. One of the things that you said, Travis, there struck me about one of my impressions too in rereading Contract with God this time is when you talked about how the people, there aren't a lot of good people in this story, period. But one of the people that comes across the best is Willie in the last story, and so that's it. I find it interesting. Then I don't know how this relates to what kind of, maybe you can elaborate on what you were saying earlier in relationship to that with all these people who do all these horrible things, the kind of one character who comes across the best, along with the doctor in the last story too, is Willie, his avatar.
Well, what I would add to the autobiographical aspect is that he acknowledged an influence from some of the underground comics he was reading, specifically Justin Green, who did Binky Brown Meets the Holy Virgin Mary. Yeah. It seems like an odd influence, but at the time I had been sending him all kinds of undergrounds. He also would sometimes comment about Robert Crumb's autobiographical comics.
Was Will especially, or at all
ask him
religious?
if he could do comics like that. He said, no, he was definitely secular. In fact, when Contract with God first came out, he showed it to a neighbor who was a very religious Jew. And the neighbor was convinced that Will had become religious. And he also loved his interpretation of the first story. And Will found that amusing. Comics.
So would you know why since he wasn't, why did he choose
those
that
are three
context?
It's a good question. I wish I had asked.
Having some influence
without God in the equation, though, he has nobody to express
was
anger
Will
to.
especially, or at all religious?
So God, may at least indirectly,
no, he was definitely secular.
Him wishing there's somebody to be mad
when Contract
at.
with God first came out, he showed it to a neighbor who was a very religious
He told me
Jew.
that when
And the neighbor was
their
convinced
daughter died
that Will had become
and
religious,
wanted to see
of the first
a rabbi,
story. And they found that amusing. They listened to the
So,
rabbi, and
why
Will was very
since he wasn't,
dissatisfied.
why
He
did he
said it
choose
was
that
just a lot of
religious
platitudes.
it's a good
It was
question.
nothing personal. It was nothing helpful. And whatever slim faith he might have had,
One of the things I think I mentioned to you privately,
the
a short
rabbi
time
had no
ago
explanation for this tragedy.
at the very end of the Contract
So I think
with God, where
in a Contract with God, God is a stand-in
the
for
rock
just
that has the contract on it,
His
Life.
name is Life Being Unfair,
Right.
and you
Am I
have to yell at
pronouncing that right?
someone.
Close enough, Moshe. Yeah.
And
God.
and Ann
Thank you.
Eisner
Thank you,
told me
Dennis.
years
Thank
later
you.
that
Thank you.
that
That's come
was
out of the screen
Will's
sharing.
Hebrew
So we've
name.
run out of time. We could
So
obviously
read
go
into
on
that what you
for
will.
hours. So when you mentioned that just now, I just realized I wrote a story recently. Dennis Kitchen, thank you, Travis. Didn't realize until just this minute that I'd ripped off that final scene that you just described. Thank you, Will Eisner, and thinking something about the stay well. Well, that's where I got them
Thank
from.
you, Danny.
Okay.
Yes, and thank you, Danny.
Without God in the equation, though, he has nobody to express anger to. And so God may at least indirectly can represent him wishing there's somebody to be mad at.
I think so. He told me that when their daughter died and wanted to see a rabbi, and they went and they listened to the rabbi, and Will was very dissatisfied. He said it was just a lot of platitudes. It was nothing personal. It was nothing helpful. And whatever slim faith he might have had was eroded when he saw the rabbi had no explanation for this tragedy. So I think in a contract with God, God is a stand-in for just life being unfair, and you have to yell at someone. God.
Were either or both of his parents religious? Was he yelling at them somehow?
Not so much. His mother was perhaps more so, and told me that whenever her mother-in-law visited, she had to make sure everything was kosher. And so the mother was observant in many ways. I think the father was more cynical about it, but went along for her sake. Will told me, I forget which religious holiday it was, he and his father went to the temple, and you had to pay to get in, and his father couldn't afford it. And so they sat on the steps and listened to the service from the outside. And that also struck him as being something that couldn't really be sacred if you had to pay to get that information or to share that service. So
might have been a matter of pride. I mean, synagogues will generally let people who can't afford in, but it's a matter of pride, not wanting to admit.
In that case, it wasn't.
You know,
but he was absolutely a humanist in that.
Yeah.
I remember one time I was on a European tour with him to promote something, and we were in a hotel room in London, and there was something in a headline about the Pope that really set me off. And I went off on an anti-Catholic tirade, and he listened patiently. And when I was done, he started to tell me about the good things that Catholics did and selfless nuns in hospitals and so on. And I thought, wow, Will is defending a religion that persecuted his people for centuries. But it was a valuable lesson to me in that he saw the best in people. Even in Germany, you know, he liked the new generation of Germans. And when I said, you must resent the Germans and what they did not that long ago, and he said, the people I'm meeting are not those people. He said, they're just people. And so it was remarkable how he could set aside, you know, politics and religion in ways that I don't think everyone else of his generation could.
Thank you, Andrew Kunka. Thank you, Chris Couch. Thank you, Denis Kitchen. Thank you, Travis Langley, both in front of and behind the screen. Thank you, Will Eisner. And everybody stay well.
Thank you, Danny.
Yes, and thank you, Danny.